if I listened to my beats back then, I was a terrible producer, right? But I was able to talk my way into spaces that someone that may have been a little less confident about their skill set would not have been able to do.
Peace, what's going down? It's the MEC podcast. It's a good day when we have a guest, and this is a great guest. I'm excited. He and I have never met before, but I certainly know who he is, and I'm sure a lot of you do too. It's Double O from Kidz in the Hall, the official producer and DJ for the group. And that group, just Google them and look up some of the not only legendary albums they've released, but just their overall career trajectory, going from being signed to independent labels that are iconic to major labels coming up under Just Blaze, and all kinds of crazy stories that I'm really curious to learn more about. So before we intro him, let me just remind you, because this isn't just helpful to us, it's helpful to you as well. And in case no one knows this, we're dropping this podcast around end of the year, wintertime. All the labels are shutting down. All the majors are shutting down. You know, do you want to be lazy and shut down with them, or do you want to drop music and take this opportunity to start building out your catalog? Well, label shut down for about 3 months. We can give you free premium music distribution for about 3 months. Go to tolost.com, use the code MEC. You will get 3 free months of premium musical distribution, so you can get all your beats, all your albums, your entire catalog on these top streaming platforms, and even ones that you didn't know existed. Establish yourself. A lot of other people are going to be sleeping right now, taking breaks. Get a leg up. I'm telling you, because just because music isn't getting dropped at the frequency that it normally is throughout this season, music consumption is still high because people are traveling, people are hanging out with their family. So don't miss out on that. tolost.com, code is MEC. Double O, welcome to the show. Is there anything I missed in the intro that I should have mentioned?
There's always the weird non-industry things, like this Absolutely. Thing behind me, the Olympian producer, whatever, because it all happens. This is 20 years since I ran in the Olympics, and also 20 years since kind of Kidz in the Hall actually formulated, which was right around the same time. Knowledge was graduating. College came out to LA, and our first mixtape was basically done probably 3 or 4 weeks before I left for Europe. So pretty crazy anniversary and times in general.
You know what's so interesting, because there's this stereotype about, well, there's a lot of stereotypes, but especially about people in the hip hop space, that we're all very one-sided. We're lucky to be talented at making beats or rapping. And not only you, but Knowledge as well, are well-rounded to an extent that's just uncharacteristic of the average human. But then also we had Young MC on here, and also a college graduate, also incredibly educated as to the music business, which is unfortunately also exceptional for a person in the music industry. We talk about that all the time. I don't even know how you could balance all that, because you're not just making music. You know, your group formed in college, mm-hmm. and the education didn't stop there. It only expanded alongside the music. So you had all these kind of parallel career trajectories. Where was the balance involved in that?
There was no balance. I just had to pull my my transcripts for a new position. I was like, oh man, I did reminded of what that looked like. They're
still pulling transcripts at this age.
Oh, hey, if you're trying to get into the EU, they do not play. But yeah, I mean, So I often hear a lot of people talk about, don't go to college, don't do this, especially if you know you want to get into music. And while I do understand the sentiment in that, because there's a ton of investment involved, especially if you're paying for it yourself, everything that has come in terms of my past successes, failures, et cetera, wouldn't have happened if I wasn't in college, and specifically at college at the time that I was in school. Like, I went to the University of Pennsylvania, Philly, and John Legend was a year ahead of me. Ted Chung, Snoop's manager for years, and was a year ahead of me. A ton of other executives, and that actually is what gave Knowledge and I the independent spirit to pursue things in a non-traditional path. I mean, at that time, watching, and this is a long time ago for many of the young listeners, but, watching people make something in their dorm room, be able to burn it on CD and sell physical copies and make money, or even produce a 12-inch back then, was an amazing thing. And then for it to work, right? To watch someone like John Stevens go from, oh, he's singing in the choir, to, oh, yeah, did you hear he's on that new Lauryn Hill album, to, oh, now he's out and signed. It was immediately a front seat of inspiration into, oh, maybe we could also make this thing happen. But I think it just comes down to, all of it really comes down to just being able to take stock of your environment and the moves that you need to make in order to find, hopefully, where that path to success is. And I don't think it matters where you are at that point. It's much easier now. Then you still had to make the leaps of going to a big city, going to LA, going to New York. But I think that ultimately there was no balance then. I did not do as well as I should have in school, but the opportunities it gave me still pay dividends today. Me being able to work in, I got into back then they used to have a minority internship program for Sony. And I was able to work in Sony studios in between my junior and senior year. And that was where I made the decision, like, oh, I'm going to be a producer because this is what I want to wake up and do every single day. Because I got, again, that front seat to be in New York at the studios, in sessions with Beyonce and Kelly, with, Corey Rooney, just like all Rodney Jerkins, all the heavy hitters. And again, having that.
All that.
Yeah. Sometimes I don't know if part of it is me being the most important thing I learned at Penn. And I was there at the same time as, the Jay Penskes and the Ivanka and Donald Trump Jr. as well. But what they used to drill into our head was say yes and buy the book later. So this idea that you are smart enough to learn what you need to, even if you don't know it in that question. And I spent a lot of time. I was not, if I listened to my beats back then, I was a terrible producer, right? But I was able to talk my way into spaces that someone that may have been a little less confident about their skill set would not have been able to do. Like, the job itself was to just be stuck in the equipment room and delivering the product when sessions were getting set up. But from day one, I told the person who was running the program, like, hey, the first opportunity, like, I want to be able to be in these sessions, learning, being an assistant or the assistant to the assistant, and learning as much as I can with this limited time that I had. And as long as I basically didn't act crazy and didn't get kicked out, it was fine. So I was, through that, I was able to really, like I said, get that front seat. Just get amazing opportunities that still, I think, help me to this day.
No, I love that statement, because I feel like that's just every successful producer I know, with some exceptions. And I'll just speak for myself. I'm certainly not the most talented producer in my city by a long shot, nor my state. I'm from the state where we got the Business Boys and the Rico Loves and everybody. So I think what you said resonated with me, because it was just sheer willpower, stubbornness, willingness to adapt. That's what set. And I notice that with artists too. It's very rarely the artist with natural talent or the producer with natural talent that wins. It's the producer or the recording artist that just puts their head down, takes as many opportunities as possible because they have the desire to improve, not necessarily the talent already inside of them, but because they're so stubborn and because they're so steadfast, they can level up, they can cultivate that talent within themselves just via the dedication that is fueled by their passion.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, what helps and hurts people oftentimes, and I see you get into these fights all the time, and is how people identify themselves, right? I think that when we talk about, even in the producer community, where it's like the major label producers versus the beat leasers or versus the YouTube type beat makers, all of it comes down to, identity. The way that they saw themselves as a producer is a very specific thing. And that's the worldview of it as a producer. And anything that kind of falls outside of it doesn't make enough sense, or to them isn't really what being sort of a producer is. And at least for me, when it comes to my identity at that time, I was extremely overconfident, going from public school to an Ivy League school, and having been at the time, state champion in track, et cetera, et cetera. There were things that luckily inflated my ego enough that I could ride until my talent actually caught up. And that was important at the time. And being able to sort of, which I still do today, which is make quick decisions, especially when it comes to, whether it be in the music itself or even making pivots in certain directions. I think a lot of times people deliberate way too long, and the moment that overthinking engine turns on, it's very hard to turn it off and get people out of that space.
When I'm always kind of like thinking about like the lack of groups today, right? We don't see as many groups, and I think that's unfortunate. How did you guys manage to kind of stick together, have a healthy relationship? What was that dynamic like? Because that's probably a separate question than like, why do you think groups don't exist today? But like, even groups that weren't together that long eventually kind of had friction. And I'm sure it wasn't always like super easy to communicate and things like that. But what was that the group dynamic like, and how have you guys stayed together for so long?
I mean, it's interesting. I think for us, very specifically, the division of responsibilities was very delineated. Like producer, DJ, rapper, right? Like we never really, there are times where I've written hooks or, made some suggestions in terms of lyrics. And there are some times where he will have a sample or even bring sort of a beat from a co-producer and say, this is something we want to work on. In those moments, we never let ego sort of overtake what was going on, because we knew ultimately where we stood in the space. Like, and we wanted the same thing, which was to try to find this path towards the success that we, imagined that we could have.
Yeah. And then, so obviously you've seen the lack of groups today. From your perspective, like what do you think we can attribute to? Because I mean, so many groups back. I mean, like even before you guys. I mean, I feel like I can almost remember more groups than individual artists. I felt like. I mean, that's probably not true, but there were a shitload of groups.
Well, prior to us, obviously, you have like, especially in the similar space, you have the Little Brothers Then you're going to get, Tanya Morgan. And then sort of when we're around is really an explosion of groups in the blog era, right? You have us, the Cool Kids, you and I, Pactive, the Nux. Like there was, for some reason, there was just, I think what was indicative maybe of the era was the internet and especially blogs allowed for the DIY aspect to fully form. And then in that space, you kind of get an explosion of like small crews that are doing everything together. And so that was sort of the representation. I mean, really, even if you look at all the way up until An Odd Future, I mean, I still consider that sort of like the DIY ethos of there's one person that produces, there's one person that raps, there's one person that maybe sings. I mean, Brockhampton, all of those things. But when it gets to success and scale, I think it's a harder thing. I mean, no one would actually maybe attribute it, but like I look at Drake and 40 as a group, right? Like I look at that these are two very singular ideas from very early on that were like, okay, we are the creative nucleus of this music and what we want to put out into the world. And so I think there are a lot of groups. I think the way in which they're represented to the world maybe looks a little different. And that's probably, the basics. It's money. It's what's easier to be promoted. It's much harder to dress 2, 3, 4 people than it is to dress one person. It's easier to cover the rent of one person for much longer than it is to cover, Right. So there's to me like it's more of a economic thing that it is basically just a feeling.
The roles were clearly delineated, but was there ever an issue or a discussion around like the economics around it and how that gets split? Is it just like, hey, everything's 50-50, I respect what you do, you respect what I do?
Yeah, that was it from day one. Everything is 50-50. We had that conversation early. It was when Knowledge Not first started, we were not a group. Like, it was actually, I had a production company with one of my close friends, and he was a rapper that was signed to it along with a few other artists. And as people, disappeared, got regular jobs, or decided to go in other directions, it was just left to us at the end of the day. And so we had the wherewithal to know, like, hey, we grew up on the groups of the 90s that are no longer cool with each other. So we understood, like, okay, in order to do this right, like, it just needs to be this. And, and we're rocking. Funny enough, though, the industry never wanted it to be successful in that way. Knowledge's first deal, even after the Kids in the Hall stuff starts working, is a solo deal as an artist when John Monopoly, Kanye's manager, signed us to Hustle, and then eventually we did the deal. Our first deal with Rawkus. Our first deal with Rawkus is a solo deal for Knowledge. It actually isn't a Kids in the Hall deal. We had a carve out for Kids in the Hall because we knew we still wanted to do mixtapes, but their idea was, funny enough, it's like with the rise of Lupe and the rise of Kanye and Rhyme Fest at the time, there was this explosion of a certain kind of Chicago rap. And they were like, okay, the college dropout is out here killing it, but now we have sort of the college graduate, right? Like we have the guy that comes from all of this stuff, but also he's the new incarnation of the Talibs or the Mos Defs with the same dude who's backing Kanye at the time. So, let's run this play that way. It wasn't until probably a year later where they felt that we didn't have a hit record, funny enough, coming from Rawkus, but they didn't feel like we had a strong enough record that we were like, okay, we're going to go and just make another Kids in the Hall mixtape. And in the process of making that mixtape, another label reached out to us And so they were like, no, you don't need to put it on another label. Just come and put it out through us since you're already signed to us with Knowledge. And in doing that deal with them, which is only a 1-album deal, that's when everything clicked and worked, right? So the first 2 or 3 Kids in the Hall albums were always sort of based on this idea that we would put out a project or mixtape before the Knowledge solo album, but they ended up being the vehicle, until we understood probably after the second one, like, oh, okay, well, this is the vehicle, right? Like the solo stuff will come, but this is the thing that's working and connecting right now.
So when they were talking about possibly being a solo thing, like how are you receiving that, and what was the conversation between you and Knowledge just to keep everything cool?
I mean, again, it goes sort of to my identity, right? In my head then, and even to a certain extent now when I'm always trying to figure it out, I admired Pharrell, I admired Timbaland, and they weren't always in groups to create the successful artist. So my identity was based on, can I build the body of work as an executive producer and as a producer and deliver that to an artist and give them success. And that was kind of the focus of everything I did. So it wasn't stepping on my ego in any way to not be in the limelight.
Dope. I mean, I think that's huge in, continuing to make that work, because I think a lot of people would react differently to that and be very, very upset.
Yeah, it was at the time I watched a lot of it happen. I've had her on my podcast, so I can talk about it, but I talk a lot with Miss Jack from J Davy, because they were signed to Warner a little bit earlier than us. And it was the same sort of thing. As soon as they got signed, then it was like, okay, yeah, Brooke, you're the producer in the group, but the front woman, let's just get you with Timbaland. Let's just get you with the big artist and try to basically break the group up, even though we have it signed, to make the big records that we think could be made. And yeah, it can create friction in that way. But yeah, I mean, for us, I guess I just looked at it as, what can I do to make the biggest, best, strongest records? And that's all that really mattered for me at that time.
Did Knowledge ride for you in the same way that you rode for him or the group?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even now, it's there's solo music that he's working on, and he'll still sort of send it to get notes, to get any sort of my opinion on whether or not, what the strong records are and things like that. Because I think we have just an understanding of, for both of us, what our strengths are and hopefully how to make records better, even if I'm not the one actually, pushing buttons or playing keys on it. And during that time, yeah, I mean, I was there sort of every step, even for most photo shoots, any of the things that I was not directly involved in was still around for it. So it's almost like I kind of became part of the production or management team to an extent, just to be there and be a part of the journey.
Has that always been in you, kind of that disposition? Because hearing like, okay, one, you're an Olympic athlete, meaning that you were elite in high school, then went to an Ivy League school. So you're an athlete at an Ivy League school, also making music, right? The way that that's positioned, you're the guy in every arena. You're an athlete, regardless of what your grades were, you're a genius to some degree, because you're at an Ivy League school and playing a sport, and you're functioning as a creative. I think the misconception a lot of times is that you're either number one or you're just not important. And I think there's such a value in number twos. I think number twos are almost more important. And I'm not calling you a number two saying that you're less valuable. It's saying that you can deflate your current value in order to join a team. That's what I feel like a number two is, like a strong number two. You are probably and obviously a great number one, but also can say, hey, the team is more important. Has that always been in you? Is that something you learned being an athlete? Like, where was that cultivated?
I mean, no clue. I would love to say that I understood it. I can look back at now older and there's two things. I think after things didn't sort of pan out the way that we wanted to as a group, I had to spend a lot of time, I tell most artists that the one thing you never have to worry about is going through a midlife crisis, because you go through one every 6 months because you're always like, I'm not good enough. This is like every time you make something terrible or put something out, you're always questioning and doubting yourself. And I do think, to be honest, part of me being the strong number two was not being confident enough in being number one in that space. It was very, there's always been, it took me a long time to figure out how to be okay with being in the pole position. It was much more comfortable and easier for me to be, the person behind the scenes that could do all the stuff and outwork anybody, and that,
Well, that's so interesting, because you initially started the conversation by saying you got your foot in a lot of doors by being overconfident, and then to complement, I don't see it as a contradiction, because I experienced this too. To complement that, you also said that your lack of confidence helped you in a way too, because you never overestimated yourself. And so I think that comes with a degree of preparation, or at least the impulse to prepare and the impulse to learn.
Yeah, I think it's there's been this feeling that I've had. I don't have it anymore, but in the same way that we talk about musicianship in production, right? There's always kind of this lingering idea. It's like, am I a hack? Right? And like, even if I can excel and make moves a certain way, I am not the best musician in the world. I'm not the person that's picking up 5 different instruments and playing bass. And every time you step into a room where that happens, you're always immediately humbled. You know what to do with it, from a production side, but you're always still in awe of that ability. And so I think it's always it's been for me finding the balance between those two things, of being able to be like, okay, when I step in the room with Just Blaze and he's chopping up a record, I'm like, no, whatever he found in there, no, I'm not finding. But I have to, having the front seat at this, I have to be able to figure out how I can use the different pieces of confidence that I do have to tell this story my way. So it's always that battle. Like you said, it is a duality. And I think that is that's what you're always fighting is, it's imposter syndrome, right? It's I'm in the place, but then you look around and you're like, should I be here? So at least in a lot of those ways, when it comes to group dynamics, it was easier for me to be like, okay, well, I don't have to be necessarily always be the person that's in in every picture in those things. But ultimately it became the group being the thing meant that I had to be in there and upfront in a different way. So I was almost fighting it.
Well, and I think that's good information for producers too. And not every producer is going to choose to be a part of a group dynamic and put themselves in front of a camera. But I think increasingly more and more, you're seeing the rise of solo producers, not necessarily even groups. So the dynamic is now tilting, whereas traditionally it was group of producer, rapper, and then suddenly the rapper is the one that's becoming, the one with more weight. And as you said, the label was kind of trying to play up that that imbalance. But speaking of all that, was the Just Blaze connection one of those kind of Just Blaze changed my life situations where, had you not met him, would your trajectory have maybe been different and not so focused on music?
This will always be the funniest story, but it goes, again, it's a part of the hilarious lore of these Kids in the Hall. So all this overconfidence, all this stuff, right? As me thinking that my music is better than it needs to be. And had knowledge demos. The partner that I had in the production company when I first moved to LA, we swore we thought we were going to get this deal with, I don't know if you remember 310 Motoring at the time, which was like a really big, it's like what platinum is now, but it was basically like they did all of the rappers' cars, things like that, and they were starting a record label, and they liked what we had made, and they were like, "Oh yeah, we want to sign you guys." So I moved out thinking like, I just graduated, I'm about to get a deal, this is all cool. And then all of it fell apart, and then they eventually got indicted by the feds and all kinds of other stuff, but that's later on. But I immediately had to start from scratch all over again. Because I moved out with like $2,500 to LA, sleeping on my friend's floor, thinking that was about to be the deal, and had to start from square one. And I ended up getting a job, hilariously enough, at T-Mobile, because at the time we were not like in a full recession, but we were in something of sorts that reminded us of that during that administration. And that was the only job I could get easily. And the day that I start working is the day the Sidekick comes out. So the first T-Mobile Sidekick comes out. And the first thing I say is, I'm like, this is going to kill it in the music industry. And I had like one or two connections at the time, but I basically, from a T-Mobile retail store in Westwood and then eventually Santa Monica, become the guy that is selling the Sidekick to everyone in the music industry. For some reason, when T-Mobile had released it, it released in like LA and wasn't really in New York yet. So it was on the West Coast. And through like, shout out to another producer, Gerard Harmon, who was producing for MC Light at the time, and another a publicist, Echo Haddix. Everyone just started sending everyone in the industry to me, and I became that guy for people like Ja Rule, Snoop, a ton of people. I'm literally just selling them T-Mobile Sidekicks at scale. And one of those guys becomes Just Blaze. He's this huge tech head. And so that's where we meet and begin. And yeah, it absolutely changed my life, because I go from being a person who literally is just wearing a T-Mobile shirt, selling Sidekicks, the black and white ones too, to people in the industry, to being a person that just confided in enough that every time he was in LA, it's like, yo, pull up to the studio, or he had some new stuff. And we always sort of started our relationship just based on like tech, fun things, music. And then it was like a year or two later where I actually started saying, oh, hey, here, I'm a producer. Here's some beats.
Okay. So you waited a whole year to even
absolutely
divulge that you were a producer okay. Cause a lot of people wouldn't have done that. They would have immediately been like Sidekick, but here's the demo CD in the Sidekick.
Yeah. It was, because I was balancing immediately when the music stuff stopped working and I was working at T-Mobile, it was like, okay, I had taken off probably about 5 or 6 months from training in terms of track. So I was like, let me get into that. And then that kind of became the pivot. Still making and producing music all the time, but was a little bit focused more on work in that. And then whenever Just would come in, just hanging out in the studio and just sort of learning, also having the ability to kind of be a fly on the wall during that time. And it really wasn't until the first Kids in the Hall stuff started coming together that the music stuff, even for him, he hears producers all the time, right? Something I always try to tell young artists and producers is don't be discouraged if your heroes or your, people that you look up to don't necessarily immediately say, oh, this is the greatest and hottest thing you've ever made. I'm going to put you on. Because if that happens, it's only because you're immediately useful to them. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but I mean that in a way like if they see that you can be immediately a part of their workflow, their situation, that is how you're going to kind of immediately get in those spaces. And don't be discouraged because it may just be that what you're doing, they don't necessarily need, but it doesn't mean that the world doesn't need it. I think a lot of times people get caught up and discouraged because they, so-and-so didn't like my beats or didn't put me on in some way. And it's just like a lot of times, sometimes you're getting put on because they're going to exploit your talents for their gain and benefit. And not to say that Just was going to do that, but, it wasn't like all of a sudden we were co-producing stuff, right? It was just me playing music for him, playing music. And then when Kidz in the Hall connected, it was like, oh yeah, I like this. And I'm about to start a label. At the time, he had just got the label deal with Saigon at Atlantic. And so then we became a useful part of the larger world of Just Blaze. And that ended up being sort of the path that led to success. But yeah. Oh, you're muted. I believe everyone's muted.
My bad. Just what are some of the you've obviously been in music and in the culture for a very long time. And I think we can pull out some of the qualities from some of the stories that you've told, whether it's networking or other things. But, just as a quick list for some of the listeners, like what are some of the qualities that you think you have or grown to have that have allowed you to exist in the space for this long?
I always go back to this quote that I heard from Erykah Badu years ago, but it's basically, always be of service and you'll have a job and position to do something in this game. I think it's understanding that coupled with the flexibility of identity, right? And knowing that at the end of the day, I'm still a producer. There's still a keyboard right here. There's still a push. There's still all of those things. And I'm going to make what I need to make in order to make me happy. If that comes out on a TV commercial, if that comes out on an album, or if that comes out on YouTube, or if that comes out, as a remix that I'm DJing, it's all the same stuff. And I'm not holding on to the idea that I have to be a very specific kind of producer. Because it also could be me touching nothing. And in the marketing space that I am now, putting together an event, putting together a project as a marketing activation, and producing it from the larger holistic sort of standpoint. I think the biggest thing people get caught up in is what their internal identity is telling them that they are and should be. And when that does not always jive with what reality is, it can lead to just a ton of frustration and
how did
stagnation.
And I know we're kind of jumping around in the timeline.
No, that's all good.
You toured with Lupe as his DJ.
Mm-hmm.
How did that connection happen?
I mean, Lupe's career was starting definitely ahead of ours, but it was already in a space where when we first got signed, we were doing shows together. So, Lou and Kidz in the Hall, Chill and John Manop were close. And so we'd be doing a bunch of stuff in Chicago together, a bunch anyway. So we had a relationship from, way back then. You're talking like 2005, 2006. I ended up, when I moved back out to LA, just ended up in the studio with him as he was working on Tetsuo and Youth. with another artist, and it just, we kind of just sort of rekindled the relationship. He asked me to come out and do DJ for a BT performance that he had. And then once that sort of happened, it was like, hey, do you want to come out on the road? Do you want to come out and do some of this stuff? I think it was pretty easy. It was probably at that time, I think, having had this relationship for a decade at that point, even if it was sort of on and off, he understood at least that when it comes to performing on stage as a DJ, that it was something that I had, hundreds of shows under my belt on, which is very different than sometimes pulling somebody from the club or pulling somebody just from regular, sort of DJ spaces. That ultimately I was a show DJ on tour for multiple tours. So then it worked out well. I mean, we were able to do a ton together for about 5 years. And then, the pandy.
So now part of your portfolio is you're a marketing executive.
Mm-hmm.
How did that come to be, and how did your experience in music make you desirable to the company that you work for to sit in this role?
Man, it's so crazy because, again, everything is, I'll tell the story, but I want to say, just for everybody, like, what I truly believe is the more you step in the direction, confident or not, but stepping in the direction of where you want to go, every step you make, fewer and fewer people make. And there is a point where you end up that this very small sort of platter that everybody's on, it's like, oh, we're here and we're all successful now because all of the, it's there. Going back to this, it's like there was a shout to my homie Manny. When Knowledge was signed to John Monopoly, there was a guy there, Manny, that started as an intern that same exact time. He would go on to be an executive at a bunch of places. And then as we were coming out of our fun little global pandy, I was looking for other opportunities that didn't always have to rely on an artist for paying my bills. That game. This was part of me also understanding. It's like, oh, I need to. It's remember that whole conversation about being able to play the second very easily. It also can come to bite you if you're always worried about the first for paying your bills. And so, we spoke about it. He was leaving a company. There was an opportunity open. And I think ultimately he understood how to translate internally the skill set to the powers that be to at least get the interview. And then from that, through the interview process, I think I proved that all of that stuff could happen. Because when it comes down to it, as a producer, sure, I was making the beats, but I was also doing the split sheets, approving and, finalizing all of the album artwork and all of the things, helping conceptualize what the music videos looked like. Doing all of these things, even as I got over to working with Lupe, it's like, okay, yes, I'm DJing with him, but I also know all of the records. So I'm also doing, hype man stuff, all the ad libs. Hey, Lupe, maybe we should look at bringing video stuff on tour. Let's add this to it. And I can run that sort of component from so it's always been like, again, a producer in this larger way. And when you get into spaces where you're talking about project management, ultimately it's all the same thing. We spend all of our time managing multiple projects, and the difference between what I do now and then, I look at it as I'm making a new album every project that I'm working on, and just what are the components that come together to do that.
A lot of that, and that's what I try to get get people to see. The one reason I'm comfortable doing the Music Entrepreneur Club is because I know that if you pursue music a certain way, you'll develop the skills necessary that are transferable to a lot of other things. But people don't understand that or see that unless you've been in both worlds. And it takes somebody like me. I'm assuming you're talking about Manny Toro.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, see, this industry is small. I try to tell people that too. Like, this industry is super small, and when you get to a certain point, like you kind of meet the same people. But yeah, like the project management skills that are required to tour and do albums, it's a similar process to any project management in a corporate gig. So you're developing a lot of the same skills. So now, do you enjoy what you do day to day in your job? I'm not gonna say as much as DJing or sitting there just producing a beat, but how much do you enjoy the job that you're in?
No, I mean, I definitely love what I do. I think, because again, it's the path that I've chosen, as weird and windy as it is, still has been on my own terms. And even the way I came into the position knowing that worst case scenario, any of the things that I need to be fulfilled, I can do myself. Right. So I think a lot of times, and I see it happen, oftentimes in certain companies, people are still trying to get their entrepreneurial rocks off inside a structure that they don't own and get extremely frustrated because they're consistently trying to, like, why won't these people listen to my ideas? Why won't these people do this? It's all this sort of stuff. And I went in knowing that I never had to worry about that. It's like, oh, you don't like the idea? Cool. If I really believe in it, I'll just go and test it somewhere else, And I think that peace of mind has made it very easy to be a contributor, learn new things, which is ultimately, I'm still the same, I'm still trying to ingest as much of this AI stuff as possible in my mid 40s to be ahead of the game as I can. Because the learning to me is still the most important part, right? I learned and taught my way to being good at production. It wasn't just like I woke up one day and it was just like, oh yeah, you're just good. You can just play at 4 years old and now you can make anything. So even when it came to the positions that I'm moving into, it's like, what can I take away from this that will essentially build out my skill set and make it even more powerful? That's one side, selfish side. The other side is I get to actually give back now to younger generations and people that I can identify and say, oh, I respect and see what you're doing. Let's invest to try to hopefully accelerate the process that you're already on, to get you from point A to point D faster than it would be if you did it yourself. And so I can spend those times and spend those dollars, hopefully wisely, identifying and moving those people into that space. Because I know what it was like, part of what, when I was signed to Duck Down, part of what I learned a ton of with, in Kids in the Hall was our relationship with Cornerstone allowed us to do a ton of brand deals, from Reebok to Adidas to Lenovo, Microsoft Zune. Like, we were a part of a ton of things. And so being on the other side now, in a very different world, I understand the value of that, especially for emerging talent or talent trying to be seen and be heard. And so being able to be a conduit for that is also extremely important.
What was the transition like for you, going from successful as an artist, but maybe not as successful as you
broke.
want to do.
Successful and broke.
Successful and broke.
It's all good. Yeah.
Well, I didn't know broke until just now, but I know you were saying it didn't go.
The blog era was a very difficult era, because I think about it now and I'm like, how silly we were to send out MP3s that could not be tracked to all these blogs to post it. And all these things would go viral, but there was no way to collect any dollars, any money. You hoped that a YouTube video would go well and you'd get a little bit there, but it still came down to sales back then. And yeah,
a lot of people still pray. A lot. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you, Erinn. What did you say?
No, go ahead. You're about to say the same thing that I'm saying. I think it's important that he's saying that.
Yeah, because a lot of people praise the blog era. They want to be back in the blog era, but they don't They understand the blog eras from a fan perspective, but they don't understand the economics or the lack of from a business or the artist perspective.
Yeah, right. Yeah. There's nothing like riding the train to your show and being super famous on it, or famous for the internet at that time, and then but you're still riding the train to the show. I get why they want it. There are things about it that I think benefit us. I do think, even though no one wants to admit it, gatekeeping is helpful, right? Like being able to have, or simplicity in a lot of ways, even though to a certain extent, to a lot of people, the blog era was complicated because you used to listen to radio or you used to listen to MTV and BET to get all your stuff. At least once you decided like, oh, okay, I'm all hip hop or Pitchfork or whatever it is. Okay, I'm just checking this every day, every Friday or every Tuesday, and I know what I got. From there, you could sort of make your decision and stick with it. And whatever it fed you, you liked or you didn't like, but it was a very easy, clean way to do it. Now there's some, it seems like there's some gatekeepers trying to figure out their way, but ultimately it's just a free-for-all of randomness. I tell people all the time, like, one of my coworkers that's never made music before and me have the same chance of going viral with a record as anybody at this point. And that is a weird space to be, but the blog era did allow for a level of cohesion, and I think ultimately, I think people also miss the community, because you also had, A3C in Atlanta. Everybody would meet up at South by Southwest. So you still, during the blog era, as strong as it was, CMJ in New York, you had these opportunities where the community building was also real, even though it was changing at lightning speed. And I think now it's really hard to have that. I see it with parties, but I don't necessarily see it with, the more just traditional music industry side of things.
Yeah.
I think so agree with that. Go ahead, Dave.
No, there's people complain at every era, right? So, and I think it's really just the frustration of like, why isn't this working? That eventually, depending on what era you're in, the complaint is just different. But ultimately, it's like, I want to be heard. Why isn't this working? And there's just a lot of artists that want to do this. And now, just that we're in the streaming era, not to say that there isn't anything wrong with Spotify payouts. I think that the system does need to be adjusted. We talk about this all the time on this podcast, but ultimately what's the underbelly of that is like, I'm frustrated. I want to be heard. I want to be successful. And it's just a tough space to be successful in.
Yeah. The mistake that I would say that we made as Kids in the Hall, that I try to get everyone to not make, the biggest learning, is to not base your success on the old model that you grew up on of whatever the industry is at that time. That you have to do everything in your power to try to be future focused, because that's how you prepare yourself, right? Like where I think we made sort of our mistakes were, we were still making records that we thought would kill it on radio, right? In a time when the blog era was moving. And had we been on a major label, the opportunities came, but ultimately the deal didn't go through. But like, we're making great R&B hip hop records, but the indie space doesn't care about those things, right? So had we doubled down and said, okay, let's hold those records until who knows when, but let's focus on building community and building direct to fan relationships and also making the music cult-like to a certain extent, what you did, right? Like what you guys did. I think there might be a different conversation now in terms of where the group is success-wise, because I think we would have been able to navigate certain things economically. But we, in our head, for maybe too long, we're still looking back at Rockefeller and Murder Inc. and all those things. It's like, oh yeah, that's the radio success is the thing that we want, that level of major label success, but we're on Duck Down, right? and when I first moved out here, I had a meeting with No ID, and I was sort of talking about the frustrations of the group, and he was like, sometimes radio records hurt you in an indie space because you don't have radio money, so it's not actually a radio record. So be mindful when making those things. It's different now, but it does. What I will say is you should be mindful if you do catch fire because you have a TikTok sound that goes viral or something like that. Be mindful of how much you can actually do on your own to make that successful, only because there will be a wall that you hit, especially when it comes to money or things like that. It's not just going to be, streaming has allowed for a lot of success, but most of it still is tied to how much money you can inject at a certain point to get it to a certain level, Yeah.
I would like to.
Well, go ahead, Erinn.
My bad.
No, you got it, Erinn. You've been letting him go the whole time. You can go.
I want to go back to like your transition. Because I think a lot of artists experience like the letdown of not having the same type of career success that they envisioned. And as I'm marking it, in hindsight, it feels and looks successful. And I think, just the experience makes it a success. I think a lot of times people have this conflated belief or expectation about like what only if I'm selling out arenas or stadiums or O2 am I successful. So how was the transition from the letdown, so to speak, to you entering in the corporate space, and then going into the corporate space? Did you immediately go in like entry level, or were you afforded the ability to come in at a somewhat higher level because you did have all the music industry experience from the artist side, but also translatable skills from the business side?
Yeah. So the letdown happened, luckily, let's say before I went back out with Lupe, right? So, yeah, I mean, it wasn't great. It was, it was definitely lost for a little bit. Came out here. I had spent most of my career really being a producer in a group. And so all of my success, even though I've got records with, the Clips, Wiz Khalifa, all these people, it's all through the group. So I looked at it like, okay, maybe I just need to, be basically a producer for hire, more of a music industry, straightforward, producer. And so came out here to LA to try to pursue that and realize the difficulty of that, especially at that time. It was the reign of Dr. Luke. And so trying to figure out like, how do you crack the pop music code? Had a couple, try to figure out a couple things. And again, it just didn't work, and so that was me then stepping back and being like, okay, well, maybe I just need another artist to work with, to do what I do best, which is, really sort of executive produce a whole body of work. And so then was working with the artist for a while, got her signed to Rhymesayers. And then the Lupe stuff came, and to be honest, the Lupe transition was helpful because your ego is always fed when you're on stage, even if they're not your own, rocking for tens of thousands of people with sing-along hit songs, right? But then at that time, sort of just figuring out what was next from a production side. I would say I'm still figuring out that transition for the career, as a producer. But when it came to the corporate transition, I think at that time it was more of needing a full pivot, fresh reset, not a clean break from the industry, but understanding that in order to going back to almost the beginning when I was selling sidekicks, being in a position where I don't have to rely on the industry to put me on in any way. It just creates a different power balance, to be totally honest. That was the thing that I noticed even back then. I was a random kid working in a T-Mobile shop, but I had something that they wanted, which was this T-Mobile sidekick. It wasn't necessarily the beats, but it allowed us to meet on a very even playing field and not, hey, here's my beat CD, please listen to it and tell me what you think. It was like, you have something that I need. I'm really just trying to build this relationship. So that's where we can meet and then see where it goes from there. And so here it's that on steroids to a certain extent, being able to provide opportunities, but also build relationships. And so it's a similar position, from 20 years ago now, but it wasn't that crazy of a transition because working on projects, hiring subcontractors, all the things, again, that we do in the music industry and stuff all the time. It's all the same stuff. It's just slightly different people. And I luckily had the Rolodex of folks that I'm from, graphic designers to, event people, to all of those things that I had worked with in the past. So it actually allowed me to really spread the wealth to a certain extent too, with people that had come along the way in different places.
So you're doing it all. That sounds to me like artist development. And with regard to, can I say her name? The name of the artist that got signed to Rhymesayers?
Nikki Jean, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Oh, well, you said it. So when you worked with her, what did that process look like? And then to just ask a very direct question for all the producers watching this, because a lot of producers want to develop artists and they want to build a sound with them. But unfortunately, the reality is, and you told this similar stories that exemplified this earlier in the conversation, where the artist gets signed, all of a sudden you who developed the sound, you get pushed aside because the label has their own producers, their own A&Rs, and now they're putting the artist that you thought you were on a team with in the room with all these producers, and you end up with one track on the album and it's the bonus track. You know what I mean? And someone huge has the single. How did that work out in this instance where you and Nikki Jean are developing sound? Then what happens when she gets signed to Rhymesayers? And now what is your current involvement in her musical output?
So I would say that I came in more of like a producer, but more of like a creative director, if that makes sense. She by herself plays multiple instruments, one of the best singer-songwriters that I know, can do anything, do it all sort of herself, and didn't have any need for a single producer to do things. I think ultimately it's figuring out what the artist actually needs and how you can, provide that. I think, hopefully this will, I don't know how long it'll take for this to come out, but we talk, Quincy Jones just passed, right? And when you look at the arc of his career and all the things that he was a part of, oftentimes they're very different roles ultimately, through that, from musician to producer, executive producer, co-producer, any and all of those things. And I think as I've gotten older, I respected that version and vision of a producer more than the original version, which was like, no, I have to take the weirdest sounds and, and put them in the MPC and mess around with them. Right. Because even with that, of the projects that we put out, I probably really was only producing like maybe 1 or 2 records. I learned a lot about collaboration on that and what it's going to take to get the right kind of sounds and sonics in for the version of the record that she liked. Because for that very specifically, you're talking about something that starts at the piano or on guitar, as opposed to previously in Kids in the Hall with Knowledge, where it's oftentimes either starting with the beat or maybe with a freestyle on something else, right? And so it's a much different view of production of like, okay, how do you turn this thing that is just that into a full-fledged produced record? There's a lot of versions of records that are not out because it takes a long time to sort of figure out what that is. And so, yeah, it took a lot to figure out sort of what the sound should be. At the time, she had already put out essentially her big singer-songwriter project where she worked with all of the Hall of Fame songwriters before, I think, like 1960 or 1970, and then put this project out, but it wasn't her. So the number one thing when we went into anything that was coming out with what she did next was to make sure it was 100% her perspective and view in her songwriting, and not her sort of co-writing with somebody and making a version of a Burt Bacharach record or a version of a Jeff Berry record. And then because she's from Minnesota, the Rhymesayers relationship had existed. She had done some stuff with Slug from Atmosphere. I had a separate relationship with them. With Kids in the Hall, we've toured with Brother Ali. We've toured with Slug and Ant for years. And so it made sense. She comes from, having written Hip Hop Saved My Life, the hook for Lupe, and having sort of this hip hop songwriter world that she lived in. We looked at Rhymesayers as this place that just, they know how to do independent music well. And instead of going into the major label system, it made sense to look and explore in that sort of space. And in terms of the relationship now, she's not really, we put out a project. Things changed for her in terms of the pandemic as well. And so, she's not putting out music. So there isn't really.
Okay. I guess how do producers make sure that this sounds
contracts?
Well, no, just how do they, okay, never mind. You answered it.
Yeah, no, I think ultimately you can't be afraid. This is an industry of handshake deals all the time. And that can run into a ton of issues with managers, and that can turn into a ton of issues with the creative service providers, let's call them, right? Because it's producers, it's, video directors, it's all of these people that are super creatives, but they're also providing a service in the process. I think it's really hard to defend against it. Managers, it happens to managers all the time, right? Like there's always the manager that was there, that was a part of the journey on the way up, and then somehow gets X'd out or is no longer a part of it for some reason. I don't know if you can really defend against it as a producer. And maybe you don't, and maybe that's what, I'm trying to think, because there's never been like situations where I've just been like 100% just cut out from. It's more of sort of transitioning out of. But of the situations that I've been close to, a lot of it comes with that, whatever that internal relationship was. I mean, once it becomes an issue, if your goal as a producer is to blow up the artist, and that artist's goal as an artist is to become the biggest artist they can become, those may not always be, in sync in order for that to happen. And you have to be okay at a certain point with letting that artist transition and become the biggest thing that they can be, like I look at, I'm trying to think, there are producers that have started with, now I have to look the name up. For some reason, it's escaping me. Sorry, hold on. Maybe you would know. I'm trying to think of Lana Del Rey's producer.
That's an Erinn question.
The Erinn first... but he's like a big hip hop producer.
That's what's her. That's Billie Eilish's brother, but I don't know Lana Del Rey's. If I do, I know it's not top of mind.
Yeah, he was a big hip hop producer. He also produced Cudi. Because they are Emil, that's right. Emil Haney. So he produced the first Cudi album. He produces the first Lana Del Rey album. And he's very much like a 40 in those ways. He's developing that sound for both of those, a lot of which he learned, working with Kanye for My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. But then you don't see him for a couple albums. The name isn't there often. And then there is this big sort of reuniting scenario. It's like, oh, Cudi's back in the studio with Emil, or Lana's back in the studio with Emil. And you get this, amazing moment of the sonics that maybe you as an fan fell in love with, getting that back. I think, being okay with letting your creative children go out and grow up and go to college and go to all these places and is an okay thing, It's when I look at what we were talking about before with Drake and 40, him being involved in everything from day one, there are probably projects where he isn't as involved, versus others. And again, I think it's just sort of knowing roles, being okay with it, and that internal conversation, communication, just like any relationship, making sure that that's solid.
And I know we got to wrap up soon. I think there's a lot of things to pull out from your story, in terms of, how you've gotten to where you've gotten. It's the continuous learning. It's the relationships. But what I really hear from a lot of the different examples that you've talked about is just your ability to not suffocate something so that it doesn't exist, right? Because a lot of people will take an opportunity and present that they want to be such a part, they want to overplay an opportunity where you look at it and look oh, well, this doesn't really need all of me. This just needs this piece of me. And that's okay, because that's going to make the project the best, or that's going to be the best for the group or the overall, the bigger picture. Your ability to do that time and time again probably feeds into you that's how you build great relationships and get more opportunities. Because I think some people might see an opportunity and be well, I need to get as much of this as possible because that's what's gonna get me to the next thing. And when you do that, you might fuck up that opportunity for everybody.
Oh yeah, I've done that too. Don't worry.
Learning from doing that before, now you kind of know you kind of analyze the opportunity and know like which piece of you that it needs or how much of you it needs to succeed.
Yeah, it goes back to that Erykah Badu thing, right? So, or sort of like being of service, right? You don't need to provide all the services. You just need to provide the right ones. And truly being flexible and okay with, again, your internal identity. I think that's the biggest, that's the biggest thing is most people really run up against a brick wall, not because of external things. They're running up against a brick wall because their version and vision of themselves is not matching with what the reality is at the time. And it becomes incredibly frustrating when it's not panning out that way. And so, then they end up squeezing those things that feel like they're, could be a crumb in the right direction, squeezing the most out of it that they think they need and squeezing it too hard. And then it's gone.
And I've seen everybody do this. Like I've seen managers do this. Like an artist might just need a little bit of information, but no, I need to manage you in order to give you this information. So I need the 20% going forward, as opposed to, oh, you just need a little consultation or you might need an introduction, but they hold that back because they want to cling on and manage the situation.
Yeah, I had to catch myself the other day, a couple months ago on that, coming across an young artist that my friend introduced me to, that in my head, it all clicks. I'm like, oh, it just needs this, and this, and it'll be popping cool. And then having a conversation with them and being like, oh, but the number one thing it needs is this person has to want it more than I want it and know how to make it work. Mm-hmm. And I can do all of the little tweaks and things for this to happen. But if this person doesn't want it as bad as they should, it's just not going to happen. And being, that comes with age of being able to identify those scenarios early, hopefully, so that you don't put your all into the thing. Because it may not even be that you're squeezing it too hard or you're milking it. It may be that there was a fatal flaw in it from the beginning that you just didn't see. And then so it not working out is because it was never necessarily going to work out, right? But you invested all this time and energy into the thing, and now you're frustrated because it didn't happen.
Yeah. Well, man, we're going to have you back at some point. I know that you catch a lot of our clips. So when you see a clip that you are excited about or disagree with,
keep talking. Keep talking shit.
Well, the next one will have to be more of like debate style on topics that we've left on here before.
I'm down. Don't be afraid of AI. AI is the way. Everybody use it, chase it, fall in love with it. The next great new innovation is going to come because of an 8-year-old kid that's just using it and only knows that. Whatever else. Producers, stop fighting. There's money out here for everybody. Like, if you're on YouTube and you're making money, if you're on BeatStars and you're making money, if you're a major label producer making money, if you're a DJ producer making money, like, we're in a renaissance of producers having an ability to dictate their own careers in a very innovative and interesting way that did not exist when I was, trying to get in the music industry. And the only thing most producers lived off of was their upfront, right? They would get paid for a beat half up front. And then if they got the back end, great. But that's all they survived on. And now there's so many opportunities. You're still a producer regardless of how you're doing all that stuff. So, expand your identity and appreciate all the different routes in which it can happen.
Yeah, and speaking of appreciation, we'd appreciate all of you getting your music out, and you'll appreciate yourself for that. Seriously, don't sit on your music, especially not now during the winter. A lot of us have time, so if you're a student, you got some time. If you have some time off, you got some time. Sign up. There's really no risk. TwoLost.com, use the code MEC. Get all of your music on the DSPs. or through the DSP, get them all on all the streaming platforms. Instrumental albums, projects that are just sitting there, whatever. It's free for 3 months, and my recommendation would be to upload the music, but schedule it all out so it's not all dropping at the same time. And you should be doing that anyway to get on Release Radar and to have a rollout. You know, it doesn't have to be a huge rollout, small rollout. Just let people know it's happening. Let people know it's coming. Get the pre-save links going. TooLost.com. The code is MEC. And Dolo, we appreciate you. How do people follow you and keep up to date on all of your?
Yeah, it's GoDouble, GODOUBLE, the number 0 on all platforms.
GoDouble.
And I will also be using the MEC code to put my music out, because it's always a reminder I'm sitting on too much. So
there you go. I mean, I probably will at some point, probably when the snow is falling and I feel like I'm trapped in the house for real. Not with just psychological boundaries, but actual physical piles of whiteness that are surrounding me, which is also a metaphor for where I live. But appreciate all of you. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will catch you on the next episode, same time, same place next week. Peace.
Thanks.
Peace.